Open the water.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Gary Sasso. I'm the Dean of the College of Education. I want to welcome you to our lecture series event, Leaders of Practice. Tonight, we will be discussing school reform and how we might reach common ground, that might be difficult, to improve outcomes for our children, and we have a very special guest. As you know, it's a discussion that's among the most contentious and polarizing in education. There has been a steady drumbeat of concern in recent years, suggesting that there is a crisis in our schools. Our educational system is a disaster. Our public schools are broken. Society is failing our schools. American education is in crisis. American schools are in a state of terminal decline. That's what we hear. In our college, what we've been attempting to do is to get experts from both sides of the debate together on this stage to ask them to set aside some of their differences and their animosity and find just a little patch of common ground so we can all work together. I'll give you a little history. For 8 months last year, we negotiated with our speaker tonight, Dr. Ravitch, and Michelle Rhee, who was at that time the head of Students First, to come to Lehigh and discuss the major issues of contention and how they might be, if not resolved, at least set aside in order to work together. We were very close to an agreement over those 8 months, but it fell apart at the end. I shouldn't say this, but I will, since I've been talking to Diane. Diane's opinion was that it was because Michelle is a scaredy cat, which wasn't quite what we had in mind when we discussed common ground. What we're doing now, we're inviting people separately from both sides of the debate to talk and then respond to what we believe to be some of the questions that would be posed by critics of their stance. The way it will work tonight is Diane, Dr. Ravitch, will present her thoughts on the issues surrounding school reform. She has then graciously agreed to join me for a discussion over there. I'll pose a few questions regarding charters, regarding choice and privatization, and finally ask her to point us to common understanding that will move us forward. In our College of Education here at Lehigh, and among some of the other graduate colleges of education in the country, we've been suggesting that it might be helpful to listen a bit to those who are dedicated to the most objective and unbiased research and the interpretation of that research to help set policy rather than political considerations. But if you wade into this debate, you need to have a thick skin. In much of what you read in the popular press on school reform, you find countless examples of the major forms of logical fallacy. Ad hominem arguments appear to be leading the pack right now, followed closely by confirmation bias and straw man arguments. We have, in our college, for our stance, been called naive by well-meaning people on both sides of the school reform issue for our stance. And to be fair, there is a history to suggest that public policy is not set by the best social science research, but by other political kinds of considerations. We've also been called a bunch of elitist latte drinkers who don't know much about the real world, and I do enjoy a nice latte. Our college produces a yearly research-oriented publication, Theory to Practice, and in the current issue we have what I think is a balanced discussion of some of the issues surrounding teachers' unions, but we immediately received an angry email from an alumnus who accused us of being anti-charter, anti-reform. Then, the next day, got a call from a person who was upset because he thinks the article is supportive of those who wish to privatize schools and who said he would never donate to the college again. But he never donated to the college in the first place. So there's that. It is a mess out there. Our speaker tonight, Diane Ravitch, Dr. Ravitch, has willingly walked, some would say sprinted, into the middle of these issues with a strong and compelling message regarding the importance of public schools to our democracy and a spirited critique of charters, privatization, and school choice. Diane has just been named the #1 ranked educational scholar with the greatest public influence by Education Week, Rick Hess's blog, and you can see why. She's professor of education at NYU and a historian of education. From 1991 to 1993, she was Assistant Secretary of Education and Counselor to Secretary of Education Lamar Alexander under George H.W. Bush, has been a member of the National Assessment Governing Board, which oversees the National Assessment of Educational Progress, appointed by President Clinton. She is the author of Reign of Error, The Hoax of the Privatization Movement, and the danger to America's public schools. And following her presentation tonight, she will be signing copies of that book out here in the main lobby. She's also the author of The Death and Life of the Great American School System, How Testing and Choice Are Undermining Education, EdSpeak, a glossary of education terms, phrases, buzzwords, and jargon, The Language Police, Left Back, National Standards in American Education, a Citizen's Guide, What Do Our 17-Year-Olds Know, The Schools We Deserve, The Troubled Crusade, American Education, 1945 to 1980, The Revisionists Revised, The Great School Wars, New York City, 1805 to 1973. That's just some of the stuff. She has, in addition, edited 14 books, lectured in several countries, and her lectures and books have been translated into many languages, including Polish, Spanish, Lithuanian, Latvian, Russian, Belarusian, Ukrainian, Chinese, Arabic, Swedish, and Japanese. In contrast, some of my work has been carefully translated into English. I could go on and on. 2004 Leadership Award of New York City Council of Supervisors and Administrators, the 2005 John Dewey Award from the United Federation of Teachers, the Common Book Award from the Hoover Institution. She's been awarded honorary degrees from Williams College, Reed College, Amherst, the State University of New York, Ramapo College, St. Joseph College of New York, Siena College, Middlebury College, and Union College, and most recently has received the Gravemeyer Award from the University of Louisville for The Death and Life of the Great American School System, How Testing and Choice Are Undermining Education. We are immensely pleased and honored to have her with us tonight. Please welcome Diane Ravitch.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you very much, Dean Sasso. It's a great pleasure to be here at Lehigh. Let me tell you that if you have the urge to tweet, feel free. It's interesting for me to be here because a couple of years ago, Lehigh invited me to debate Michelle Rhee, as Dean Sasso told you, but he didn't give you the details. I'm going to give you the details. I agreed. She agreed. But then she said we should each have a debate partner. I agreed. And then she said we should have 2 debate partners. I agreed, although I realized that having 6 people up here would no longer be a debate, it would be a panel discussion. And then she pulled out, claiming that she couldn't find a 3rd partner to join her. Well, I mention this because Lehigh has asked me whether it's possible to find common ground between the people who call themselves reformers and people like me who think that their goal is not to reform public education, but to destroy it. If someone wants to tear your house down, can you reach a compromise and tear down half of it? Well, I feel that you are entitled to a debate, and so I'm going to do my best tonight to debate someone who shares Michelle Rhee's views. I will call him Mr. Reformer. It won't be a fair debate because I will always get the last word. But that's what happens when you don't show up. So let the debate begin. Mr. Reformer will tell you that our public schools are failing, that our test scores are declining. He will say we used to be number 1, we're not anymore in the world. He will say that we're in a terrible crisis and we must do something drastic to save our nation from certain destruction. I respond, Mr. Reformer, the federal test called the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP, shows that test scores are at their highest point in U.S. history for white students, black students, Hispanic students, and Asian students. NAEP has been giving national tests since 1972, samples of students. It's been sampling students in all 50 states and D.C. since 1992. It's considered the gold standard of testing. Mr. Reformer responds by saying, well, we have a graduation crisis and a dropout crisis. We must act at once. And I respond, Mr. Reformer, did you know that graduations are at their highest point in history for every group in our society? Did you know that dropout rates are at their lowest point in history? Mr. Reformer says that our public schools are so mediocre that they actually threaten national security. He is reiterating a report written by Joel Klein and Condoleezza Rice that came out in 2012. Our public schools are a threat to our national security. So, echoing their recommendations, he says they must be replaced by charter schools and vouchers to break up the monopoly that controls public education, and they must immediately adopt Common Core standards. I respond to Mr. Reformer that our public schools are not mediocre. They reflect their communities. Some are outstanding, some are good but not great, some are the heart of their community, some struggle because they serve impoverished communities. We should help them, not close them. And Mr. Reformer says, poverty is just an excuse for bad teachers. Get rid of the bad teachers and poverty will disappear. I respond that poverty is the root cause of low academic performance. Did you know that the U.S. has the highest rate of child poverty of any advanced nation in the world? Did you know that nearly a quarter of our children live in poverty and half of our children live in low-income families? It's the difference between free lunch and reduced price lunch. Mr. Reformer says, well, poverty doesn't matter. I briefly lose my temper. I reply that it doesn't matter to him because he's not poor. But it does matter to children who don't have medical care, who miss school because they're often sick or because they have to babysit while their parents work at night, who don't have a good home in a safe neighborhood, who may be homeless, who can't be sure of having food on the table, who don't have a winter coat or snow boots. Mr. Reformer, though, says that he does have solutions for all the problems of our schools. He says we must get rid of bad teachers. We must evaluate teachers based on student test scores. If students get low scores, it's the fault of their teachers. Teachers who can't raise test scores should be dismissed. I point out to Mr. Reformer that no other nation in the world, certainly no high-performing nation, is doing this. Those who teach in affluent districts will get higher ratings than those who teach in poor districts. Those who teach English language learners will get lower scores than those who teach native English speakers. Those who teach children with disabilities will see small test score gains, if any, and those who teach the most severely disabled children, those with cognitive disabilities, might not see any gains and they will be fired. Those who teach gifted children will see no gains because the children are already at the top and can't go any higher. If we pursue this punitive course of action, who will want to teach? Is there a long line of people ready to step into the places of all those who will be fired? Well, Mr. Reformer brushes away my objections and says, you are a shill for the teachers' unions. And to prove it, he throws his next question at me. Don't you agree that we should ban collective bargaining so that unions can't feather their nest and protect all those bad teachers? And I replied that I support unions, although I have never belonged to one, because unions helped build the middle class in America after the Great Depression of the 1930s. They were responsible for getting a decent living wage, for limiting the hours of the workday, for making sure that workers got pensions and health care, and that workplaces were required to follow rules about safety. Today, without unions to protect them against misguided governors and legislators, teachers will be voiceless and powerless. The decline of unions, I believe, is associated with the rise in income inequality and wealth inequality and with a shrinking middle class. These trends are not healthy for our society. The nation's highest performing states, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Connecticut, have strong unions. The nation's lowest performing states and the Deep South do not. Mr. Reformer is unimpressed by my answer. He asked, but surely you can't defend tenure. Why should teachers have a job for life? And I respond that tenure in K-12 education is not the same as tenure in higher education. College professors with tenure have a job for life. That's probably why there are so few of them. 70% of the people who teach in higher education don't have tenure and they're adjunct faculty. But those who do have tenure have a job for life. Teachers in K-12 do not have a job for life. They have a right to due process, a right to a hearing before an independent arbitrator if their principal wants to fire them. Teachers don't give themselves tenure. The unions don't give them tenure. Their principal reviews their performance over a period of 3 or 4 years, depending on state laws, and then decides whether they have earned job security. So if bad teachers are getting tenure, then we have an administrator problem, not a teacher problem. Tenure protects teachers from being fired for arbitrary and capricious reasons, such as their race, their sexuality, or because a parent complained that the teacher had assigned a controversial novel, like Huckleberry Finn or Invisible Man, or taught a lesson on global warming, which the parent objected to. Well, Mr. Reformer is not at all satisfied with my answer. He says, but what about those sexual predators roaming the halls of our public schools? I've heard Campbell Brown. Shouldn't they all be fired on the spot? I respond that anyone accused of sexual misconduct should be removed from the classroom at once, but is still entitled to due process and a hearing. I tell him about an incident that happened in D.C. in the early 1990s when I was Assistant Secretary of Education in the first Bush administration. There was a front-page story in the Washington Post about a middle school teacher who had been accused by 7 teenage girls of having fondled him. His name was in the paper, and with so many accusers, no one doubted his guilt. But the police questioned each of the girls one by one, and they all admitted that they had made the story up to punish the teacher for giving them too much homework and low grades. And that is why teachers should be given due process and the opportunity to clear their name. Of course, if they don't have tenure, they can be fired on the spot without due process. Mr. Reformer returns to the subject of teacher evaluation and goes into a rant about how teachers are the most important factor in whether students perform well or poorly. Where scores are low, he says, teachers should be fired. When scores don't go up every year, teachers should be fired. If 70% of the students fail the state test, he says, 70% of the teachers should be fired. That's just common sense, isn't it? Mr. Reformer, I say, I don't agree with you. You can't make schools better by keeping teachers in fear of being fired. You probably read something by the economist Eric Hanushek, who wrote that 5 to 10% of teachers should be fired every year to clear out those whose students have low scores. You are referring to a methodology known as VAM, or value-added measurement. The theory of VAM is that teachers can be evaluated by the value they add to student scores, and the theory is that teachers alone can raise or lower scores. Secretary of Education Arne Duncan insisted that every state use VAM to a significant degree to evaluate their teachers. But the leading scholarly organizations have said that VAM doesn't work. The National Academy of Education and the American Educational Research Association issued a report in 2011 pointing out that there are many factors that affect learning and test scores that are beyond the teacher's control, including their home life, class sizes, peer culture, previous teachers, the curriculum, the school's leadership, and a dozen other factors. In 2014, just last spring, the American Statistical Association warned that value-added methods should not be used to rate individual teachers. This is the American Statistical Association. It said that the teacher is responsible for about 1 to 14% of the variance in test scores. 1 to 14%. What matters more, they said, is the student's home life, the student's motivation, and countless other factors. The American Statistical Association warned that use of VAM to rate teachers might have unintended consequences that reduce the quality of education. I believe they were referring to narrowing the curriculum to only what is tested, to cheating and teaching to the test. To the extent that VAM is used to fire teachers, teachers will be incentivized to spend weeks and weeks on test prep and thus reduce the time available for the arts, foreign languages, history, physical education, and other non-tested subjects. They have to. Their jobs depend on it. Mr. Reformer says, your answer proves that you're unwilling to evaluate teachers at all. You're just defending the status quo. And I replied, no, not at all. I don't like the status quo. I reject the status quo of high-stakes testing and privatization. You are defending the status quo. I'm not. I say to him, I do believe in teacher evaluation, but not by test scores. Judging the work of teachers by the bubbles selected by students on one day is not a good way to evaluate teachers. A better way is called peer assistance and review. Many districts use peer assistance and review, although Secretary Duncan is trying to get rid of it and replace it with VAM instead. With peer assistance and review, every new teacher gets a mentor, and so does every tenured teacher who has been identified by the principal as in need of help. After a year of mentoring, the mentor makes a recommendation to a committee made up of principals and teachers. Either the teacher is doing fine and needs no more mentoring, or the teacher needs more help, or the teacher should be fired. In Montgomery County, Maryland, more than 200 teachers have been terminated through this process, and many more have gotten the help they needed. This process makes more sense and is fairer than VAM. The U.S. Department of Education and the states and the Gates Foundation have now spent hundreds of millions of dollars, possibly billions of dollars, trying to make VAM work, and it doesn't work. It hasn't worked anywhere. In many states, teachers are given a rating based on the scores of students they never taught. Can you imagine? If you're an art teacher and you're being judged by the math scores of the kids in your school, this is simply wrong. In Florida, where teachers brought a suit against this, and they said, we haven't taught these kids, how can we be judged? The judge said, well, it may not be fair, but it's not illegal or unconstitutional. Makes a lot of sense, right? Teachers' ratings under VAM fluctuate from year to year, depending on who's in their class. Children are not randomly assigned. The same teacher may be rated effective one year and rated ineffective the next year, or vice versa. The same teacher may be rated effective in teaching math and ineffective in teaching reading, all in the same year, setting her up both to be fired and to get a bonus. VAM is inaccurate. VAM is unstable. Teachers should be evaluated by those who see them teach on a regular basis. Mr. Reformer shakes his head from side to side, indicating his disagreement with me, and then he asks this question: wouldn't test scores go up if we paid teachers for raising scores? Don't people work harder if they're offered incentives? And I answer, no, actually, schools have tried merit pay again and again now for almost 100 years. Merit pay has never made a difference, and it encourages teachers to teach to the test and to ignore what isn't tested. Merit pay failed most recently in New York City and in Chicago, wasting millions of dollars. In 2010, Vanderbilt University sponsored a merit pay experiment in Nashville. Teachers were offered a bonus of $15,000 if they could raise the test scores of middle school students in math. There was a control group and an experimental group, and at the end of 3 years, the economist running the experiment announced that there was no difference in performance between the students of the teachers in these two groups. The offer of an incentive didn't make a difference. The teachers in both groups were teaching the best they knew how. They didn't know how to teach any better. They were not hiding their best lessons in hope of winning a bonus. The fact is that merit pay is not a modern idea. It comes from the social efficiency experts of the early 20th century who thought that workers would produce more products per hour if offered a reward. But the cognitive psychologists in the 21st century, like Edward Deci, D-E-C-I, Dan Ariely, say that carrots and sticks don't motivate people, especially professionals. Professionals are motivated by idealism, by autonomy, and by a sense of purpose. In Dan Ariely's book, Predictably Irrational, he tells of an experiment in which lawyers were offered a fee to represent indigent senior citizens. They could find few takers. But when another group of lawyers was asked if they would represent indigent senior citizens for free, pro bono, many of them signed up to do it. Figure it out. Similar social experiments show that people respond with greater enthusiasm when inspired by idealism than when lured by money. It's strange but true. Merit pay is a zombie idea. It never works and it never dies. So Mr. Reformer changes the subject. He says, let's talk about charter schools. Let's talk about innovation. Let's talk about the outstanding results that entrepreneurs get when they open a school that is free of bureaucracy, state regulations, and mandates. And I say, fine, let's talk about charters. But first I want to ask you, if it's a good idea to remove regulations and mandates, why not do it for public schools as well? If these regulations are unnecessary, why inflict them on public schools? Why are only charters allowed to escape them? There are 2 points that I would make about the charter movement, and I could devote an entire evening to discussing the charter movement, but I'll make it brief. First of all, we now know, based on 25 years of evidence, that charters do not get higher test scores than public schools on average. In fact, in state after state, they typically get lower scores than public schools, and most of the lowest performing states in schools with large numbers of charters are charter schools, not public schools. The charter schools that do get high test scores are known for high rates of attrition and for counseling out students with low test scores and not accepting students who are English language learners, are not as many as those of the neighborhood public schools, and not accepting students with serious disabilities. So the public schools find themselves in financial distress as charter schools lure away the most motivated students with promises that they may or not be able to keep, and as public schools also enroll the most expensive and challenging students to educate at far higher proportions than charter schools. Secondly, the charter sector in many states has become an industry, a business that attracts entrepreneurs who know nothing about education but want to make money. They look at the public education budget of hundreds of billions of dollars, and they want a piece of the action. There have been scores of charter school scandals of for-profit charters taking 20% or more of the revenues just to pay off their investors or to pocket in their own bank account, of charters buying the building, then leasing it back to themselves and charging the state outrageous rentals, of charters opened by sports stars and celebrities who are high school dropouts, of charters that collect millions from the state and run very low-performing schools but are immune from accountability because of their campaign contributions. Now, the original promise of charters, and I was there in the beginning, in 1990, the original promise was that charters would get flexibility and freedom in exchange for accountability, and yet we see in many states there's no accountability for charters that are politically connected. It's true in Pennsylvania, it's true in Ohio, it's true in Michigan, it's true in Arizona, it's true in many other states. There are some good charters, to be sure, charters that do what charters were originally supposed to do, which was to take the most troubled students, the most difficult students, the students who had dropped out, the students who needed the most help. But the very idea of charters for regular students or high-performing students raises questions that we have to consider very carefully. Charters foster segregation. Charters divide communities. Charters are undermining our public school system. No high-performing nation has charters or vouchers. They have a unitary public school system, and they constantly try to improve it. Mr. Reformer says somewhat indignantly, but don't you think all parents have the right to choose their school? If they feel their neighborhood public school is not good enough, or they consider it a failing school, why shouldn't they get a voucher to go to any school, whether it's private, charter, or religious? Besides, competition will make the public schools better. It's a win-win for everyone. I repeat that no high-performing nation in the world has charters or vouchers. We know now how vouchers work. They don't. Milwaukee has had vouchers for 25 years. It's a textbook case. Voucher students lag behind their peers in public schools. Students getting vouchers in Cleveland and D.C. don't get higher scores than their peers in public schools. Milwaukee has charters, vouchers, and public schools, and students are doing poorly in all three sectors. Now Governor Scott Walker wants more vouchers and more charters so he can permanently disable public education. Why break up the public schools for a choice that dissolves the public's commitment to public education? Why privatize our public schools and destroy an institution that has been central to our democracy? Mr. Reformer glances at me somewhat defiantly, and he says, just wait until the Common Core is implemented. That's the answer to everything. Students will have higher test scores, the achievement gap will close, and everyone will be college and career ready. And I answer, I hope you're right, but I doubt it. The Common Core was never tested before it was rolled out. Most states agreed to adopt it in 2009, but it wasn't even finished being written until 2010. The states adopted because Arne Duncan said they would not be eligible for nearly $5 billion in Race to the Top funding unless they adopted college or career-ready standards, and everyone knew that he meant the Common Core. So many states adopted it, sight unseen. In New York, we've tested Common Core standards twice. The standards are set so absurdly high, and the reading levels so much higher than the grade level of the students, that 70% of the state's students failed. 97% of English language learners failed. 97% of English language learners failed. 95% of students with disabilities failed. More than 80% of children who were Black and Hispanic failed. This was failure by design. The State Commissioner of Education predicted before the test was given that 70% would fail. How did he know? How did he know? He chose the passing mark. Psychometricians know. They pre-test every question. They know exactly what % of kids will pass it and fail it, depending on where the passing mark is. And this test was designed to fail 70% of kids. There are many things wrong with the Common Core, which I don't have time to go into now, although I would like to mention the developmental inappropriateness of the early grades, particularly kindergarten, where children are expected to read in kindergarten. This is absurd because there is a normal range in which children learn to read. Some children learn to read at age 4. Some children don't learn to read until first grade or second grade. It doesn't matter. But the Common Core says all children should read in kindergarten. So many children who are not developmentally ready will be found to be failures in kindergarten. I think the controversy around the Common Core is well merited. Well, Mr. Reformer, looking slightly desperate, says to me, "You gloss over the failure of the public schools. Our nation is falling behind on the international test. Our economy will suffer if we don't get our test scores up. We are in an unprecedented crisis. Well, I say, it's not really true. Our nation has actually never really done very well on those international tests. When the first international tests were given in 1964, there were 12 nations that took the test in math. We came in last. In the 50 years that followed, we were usually in the middle or even the lowest quarter. Yet we have outperformed the other nations that had higher test scores by every measure, by gross national product, by productivity, by technological innovation, by military strength, by cultural creativity, by democratic institutions. The international test scores of 15-year-olds don't predict anything. They reveal how well students have learned to take tests. We will not be overtaken by Estonia, no matter how high their scores are. We are not threatened by Shanghai, or Singapore, or Japan, or Canada. Now, Japan is an interesting case because Japan has always had high test scores. They beat us every single time, way ahead of us. It's been in a deep recession for years, proving my point that the test scores do not predict the economic future of a nation. America's trump card has always been freedom, creativity, originality, innovation, ingenuity, kids who are curious about how things worked and figured out a better way to do it, kids who built crystal radios for the fun of it, kids who built computers in their garage, people who took pride in their work. Standardized tests reward those who pick the right box, a box of someone else's determination. They will be excellent clerks. For the 21st century, our trump card is teaching students to think outside the box, not to get the right answer, but to ask the right questions and to question the right answer. I don't think that the pursuit of higher test scores is the right goal. The jurisdiction with the highest test scores in the world is Shanghai, closely followed by other East Asian nations and cities. I urge you to read Yang Zhao's new book, which is called Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Dragon? Why China has the best and the worst education system in the world. He says it is the best because it has the highest test scores. It is the worst because those high test scores require constant test prep, rote memorization, and authoritarianism that discourages creativity, originality, and individualism. Yang Zhao says, he's now a professor at the University of Oregon, Yang Zhao says that China is trapped by its success on the international test. Chinese educators would like to break free of the testing obsession. They know it's bad for their students, but they're stuck with a system that is riddled with cheating and fraud, where students live for the test. What's the right goal for our students? I would hope that in addition to getting a good education, they're learning to be people who are kind, thoughtful, hardworking, idealistic, care about other people, and have a zeal to make our society better. That matters more than test scores. Well, Mr. Reformer is not at all happy. He steams, and he says, so far all I've heard from you are criticisms. Do you have any suggestions for positive change? At this point, Mr. Reformer is going to evaporate as I answer his question. Yes, Mr. Reformer, I do. As the saying goes, I'm glad you asked that question, and now disappear. Start with prenatal care. When pregnant women don't get prenatal care, their babies may be stillborn or born with cognitive deficiencies or developmental delays. Large numbers of poor women don't get prenatal care. The UN and the March of Dimes did a survey and found that we ranked, out of 180 nations, number 134 in providing prenatal care. We were tied with Somalia. That's a national disgrace. That's worse than mediocre scores on a math test. That is a cause of low scores. We should invest in programs to help young mothers with their babies. We should think of the spectrum from 0 to 5, when children are developing mentally, socially, emotionally, and physically, and make sure that they get a good start in life. There are programs that do this, but they don't have the money to reach many families in order to help them. We should provide early childhood education to all children, beginning at age 3. Nobel Prize winner James Heckman has shown that there are dramatic economic returns to society when young children get high-quality early childhood education. When The Economist ranked 45 advanced nations by their provision of high-quality early childhood education, we ranked 24th out of 45. That is a cause of low test scores and far more significant than math or reading scores, because it is a cause. We should provide the funding to reduce class sizes, especially where children enter school with undeveloped skills. They need extra time with teachers, but they won't get it unless their class is 20 or less. Reduced class size has been proven beneficial again and again by researchers, especially for poor and for Black and Hispanic students, and yet we ignore the evidence. We should insist that every school have a full and well-rounded curriculum that includes the arts, science, history, civics, foreign languages, literature, physical education. If it were up to me, I would like to see our schools put the arts first. This is not just sentimental. I would love to see every child have the chance to learn to play a musical instrument. Think of it. It takes self-discipline to play a musical instrument. You can't fake it. You can't cheat. You have to practice, practice, practice. And when you're good enough, you can make music with a group. What a fabulous model for all the learning that we expect from children. I would like to see states raise standards for incoming teachers. They should have at least a year of professional preparation, in addition to a subject matter degree. Teachers should be highly prepared professionals. No one should become a principal unless he or she has been a successful teacher for at least 10 years. No one should become a superintendent without experience as a teacher or a principal. This is not a place for on-the-job training. And no one should become a state superintendent without experience as a teacher, a principal, or a superintendent. Education will not be a genuine profession unless it is staffed by professionals. It should not be a stepping stone for hobbyists, resume builders, and career hoppers. We need schools that teach more and test less. Most tests should be written by teachers, not by multinational corporations. The teacher knows what he or she taught. Tests should help the student, not stigmatize or discourage him. If a test has no diagnostic value, it has no value. At present, standardized tests are given in the spring. The scores are released in August when the student has a different teacher. The teacher is not allowed to see the questions or the answers because the test has to be kept secure. Thus, the teacher learns nothing about the child other than his score. This has no value. The tests have no diagnostic value, and they're therefore useless. We don't need national testing. We already have it. The NAEP, National Assessment of Educational Progress, tests children in every state every other year by sampling. If you want to compare student performance by state, look at NAEP. You can compare any state to any other state. If you want disaggregation by race, ethnicity, gender, language, disability status, NAEP has done it. If you want to know more about the achievement gap, it's there on NAEP. We don't need to test every child every year. We are the most over-tested nation in the world. It's a massive waste of time and money, and much of it is propelled by the lobbying of the testing industry. Schools need to be adequately funded. They need psychologists, librarians, social workers, guidance counselors. They need a nurse. Governor Corbett cut $1 billion from the budget for public education, putting many districts near bankruptcy. The Philadelphia public schools, serving large numbers of students who live in poverty, were stripped of necessary personnel and resources. The city school system has only 11 librarians. This is a disgrace. Schools have a nurse only 1 or 2 days a week. 2 children died in schools in Philadelphia on a day when there was no nurse. One 12-year-old child had asthma. A nurse might have saved her life. A 7-year-old child died before he got to the hospital. There was no one in the school to help him when he collapsed. This is criminal. For-profit charter schools and for-profit virtual charter schools should be banned by law. Not 1 cent of taxpayer public dollars should pay for the evisceration of public education by profiteers, people who sell paper and computers and school furniture make a profit. We know that. People who manage and run schools should not make a profit. They have an incentive to cut costs, hire low-wage workers, and encourage teacher turnover to get rid of expensive teachers. This is not good for students, and it's not good for education. Please don't think that my role in this mock debate is meant to say that all is well and we don't need reform. We need different reforms, real reforms. We don't need privatization to destroy public education. We don't need high-stakes testing to evaluate teachers, to evaluate schools of education by the test scores of the students taught by their teachers, which is a long, long reach of causality. We don't need test scores to fire teachers, fire principals, and close schools. We don't need No Child Left Behind. We don't need Race to the Top, and we don't need Common Core. What we really need to do is to attack the root causes of low academic performance. Segregation and poverty are a toxic combination. Wherever you find both, you will find low test scores. We need to reduce poverty. If we had less poverty, we would have higher academic performance. We need to reduce segregation. Government should lead the way with incentives and programs to address these most intractable but soluble problems. If the $5 billion wasted on Race to the Top had been awarded to districts that promised to reduce segregation and actually did it, it would have changed our society in 5 years. Instead, it was wasted on more testing and more privatization. We need reform intended to improve schools, not to close them. We need to believe that we can solve our problems, not hand them off to entrepreneurs and corporations and well-meaning amateurs. We need to believe that our public institutions can be improved, not privatized, or we will lose our democracy. We must not abandon our ideals. We must not abandon our faith in democracy. Democracy is ruled by the people, not ruled by elites, not ruled by corporations. The public schools are the people's schools. Their doors are open to all. You don't need to win a lottery to enter. Public education must be, as we once hoped, a bastion of equal educational opportunity. Public education is a public trust. It is not a business opportunity. Protecting our public schools against privatization and saving them for future generation of children is the civil rights issue of our time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was wonderful. I just wish you wouldn't sugarcoat your beliefs quite so much and come on, what you really...
Well, let's see now. I didn't say anything ad hominem, did I?
No, nothing ad hominem. In keeping with what we were thinking about in finding kind of common ground on this, I have some questions that we've pulled together. Some folks have suggested some questions that some of your critics might ask. I'm sure you know that you have wide support here. You have wide support across the country, but you are also considered pretty controversial, adversarial to folks like Joel Klein, Michelle Reed, folks at KIPP, Eva Moskowitz.
Bill Gates, Barney Duncan.
We could go.
Margaret Spellings, George W. Bush, Sandy Crest, Pearson. How about this? Oh, Eli Broad.
Jeb? Yeah.
Jeb Bush.
Jeb Bush. I think that came off.
Okay. Scott Walker. John Kasich. Go ahead.
Okay. So let's start with this. Why should we believe the Diane of today instead of the Diane of 30 years ago? There was this kind of a scathing article in 2013 by Saul Stern. Why did you change? Why should we believe this Diane instead of the Diane of the past?
Well, because I have more experience. I think I have more wisdom. I think I have more knowledge. And someone asked me the other day on my blog, maybe you'll change your mind again. And I said, well, I might change if the evidence changes, but what I will never change is I will never sell out children or families or public education. Those are principles. And I have always, I think that there's a basic consistency in what I believed then and now, which is I've always believed in a liberal education for all children and the best possible education for all children. And there's a certain kind of, I think, egalitarianism, which is why we use the term, I guess, all. But I think that that's been consistent, and I think that what happened was that I was deeply engaged in two very conservative think tanks, one at the Hoover Institution and the other at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute in Washington. And I came to understand that many of the people I was working with wanted to see public education destroyed. And I'm a public of public education. I wouldn't be here were there not public schools. I come from a large family, and we all went to public schools. My mother was very proud of her high school diploma. She was an immigrant from Bessarabia. My father was a high school dropout. But, you know, public education was there for us, and I couldn't betray it by going along with people who had as their goal blowing up the public education system. So I think I reached a point where it was too much for me, and I also saw the damage that the high-stakes testing was doing. And as a member of these conservative think tanks, we often talked about why things weren't working. We understood that the charters weren't working because so many of them were failing, and yet we never admitted that publicly. But I reached a point where I thought, I can't go along with this. This isn't, if it's not working, it's not working.
Okay, thanks. Let me try this one. There's a single mother, 2 kids, living in Harlem, working 3 jobs. Her kids are in a public school. It's in bad shape. Kids aren't learning, they're disruptive, teachers are using curricula that is untested, bullying is out of control, the school's unsafe. And she wants better for her kids, and there's this alternative, and the alternative is called Success Academies, where kids behave, they pay attention, they go to school longer each day, they wear uniforms, they respect the educational process, and they maybe have a chance to get out of Harlem. This mother doesn't care about union contracts. She doesn't care about Common Core. She doesn't care about what's good for the rest of the kids. She just wants better for her kids. What do you say to somebody like her? Why shouldn't she take that opportunity for her kids?
Well, I wouldn't tell her not to. I would say, you know, do whatever you think is best for your child. I think, you know, looking at it macro, that the odds are, first of all, that her child would not win the lottery. And wouldn't be accepted. And then if her child were enrolled in Success Academy, there's a good chance that he or she might not even survive to the 8th grade because they have a very high attrition rate there. if her child has special needs, she wouldn't last long. So, take your chances, and if you get in, you might find you're back out in the same school. And I think that this picture of schools in Harlem that are in chaos is an overblown picture to begin with. It's a caricature. And I've been in many schools in poor neighborhoods where I've been very impressed with the dedication of the teachers and the parent engagement. So I think a lot of that is a stereotype. It's a way of saying that we're not going to deal with root causes, we're going to run away from them.
But you almost can't say charter schools, right? Because every charter school is different. You can't say we can do an evaluation of charter schools. You even talked about it just a few moments ago. There may be some that are doing very, very well, doing better. And wasn't that the original intent of charter schools, is that they would act as a laboratory that could then be taken into the public schools?
Well, the original idea, going back to the late 1980s, was that they would be laboratories to help the neediest kids, not that they would be judged by their test scores. You might say that the charter schools with the lowest test scores might actually be the best charter schools, because they're taking the kids who've really tuned out and need the help the most. And some charter schools have been closed because of their test scores, and their supporters say that they're doing exactly what charter schools were supposed to do. And yet we have become so test score obsessed that we are encouraging charters to be test prep factories and to abandon the original purpose. I think the original purpose is very laudable. And I think that there are good charter schools, and there are charter schools that, if you think of them as laboratories of democracy, actually, or laboratories of innovation, actually many of the high-scoring charter schools are more like schools from the early 20th century. And, with their strong emphasis on discipline, with a disciplinary code that says you'll be suspended if you don't have your shirt tucked in, you'll be suspended for this, you'll be suspended for that. I don't think that's something, I don't know that that's a lesson that public schools need to learn, to be so militaristic in the discipline. And I remember Pedro Noguera, and you may have read some of his work. He's a colleague at NYU, and he writes a lot about race and poverty. And he said that the no excuses charter schools are teaching children strict obedience. They're training children to be conformists. They're training them to be followers, not leaders. And so the question is, shouldn't a laboratory of innovation show that you can bring out something else other than obedience? And so I don't consider a military style. When I read about the no excuses charter schools, I feel like this is not a school I would want my grandchildren to go to. Certainly would not have put my children in them.
Well, you mentioned that I may be overplaying the problems in Harlem. There are some places in Philly, in other urban settings that where kids are not getting a very good education. We can talk about the reasons for that. Certainly, some of the reason for that is because of their home life, because of SES, which we know is the largest predictor of how well you're going to do.
I don't blame it on the kids. I actually blame it on the state. And I would say that in every place where you find dysfunctional schools, they're under-resourced, and there's been an underinvestment in the schools. And then the kids are blamed, the families are blamed, the teachers are blamed. But it's the state that's to blame, because the state has an obligation. When I read about what's happening and has been happening over the past several years in Pennsylvania, where Governor Corbett essentially said to Philadelphia, fire teachers, cut their pay, let them pay. Well, it's the state's obligation to pay for public education, not that the teachers aren't supposed to cut their salaries and have to pay for public education. And wherever you find, and there's a very good book that came out recently about New Orleans by a woman who spent 10 years studying New Orleans. Her name is Kristen Burras, B-U-R-A-S. And Kristen Burras, who was deeply embedded in the community in New Orleans, said, the teachers were blamed for low-functioning schools, but these were schools that the white-dominated legislature had underinvested in for decades. And then immediately, so when the charters came in, suddenly billions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars flowed. The tap was open, and then they said there's a miracle. Well, sure, there's a miracle when you start resourcing schools, but there actually is no miracle in New Orleans. So most of the schools there are failing charter schools. But it's not because of I don't blame it on the kids, and I don't blame it on the teachers. I blame it on, in the case of whether it's Philadelphia or Harlem or Bedford-Stuyvesant. Those are schools where we should be spending more than we are now. And when people say we're already spending too much, I say, no, we're not. One of the things that's come out of international studies is that the United States is one of 3 countries in the OECD that spends less on poor kids than on affluent kids.
Okay, so should, and you mentioned it, should these alternatives exist at all? In your book, you're supportive of parochial schools because they're privately funded, they have successfully navigated the church versus state issues, except they do receive some public support, right? So it's not clean. This is a pretty complex issue.
But not for tuition.
Yeah.
I believe that people should be able to go to a religious school, but they should pay for it themselves.
Okay. So what about private schools, the other private schools that receive some public support, like Lehigh University and New York University? Should they exist?
Well,
if not, we have to look for new jobs.
Higher education has always been different, and higher education has always gotten public funding, and the students get public funding, or they wouldn't. These institutions wouldn't exist. But there are lots of places that get public funding, and they're not public. I mean, Harvard gets public funding, and it's not a public university. No. You could say the same thing about, there are probably only 3 colleges in the country that don't accept any form of public money. These are very right-wing institutions, one of which is in Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
But, you know, if we said that the flow of public funding makes you public, then Boeing is a public airplane building company.
Okay.
But I think there is some crossing of the lines between public and private, but I think we have had a somewhat Swiss cheese-like separation of church and state, but where we have drawn the line historically is on tuition. And I think that if we have vouchers, a lot of the schools that get vouchers are not going to be very good schools. They're not going to want to have, they will not have the accountability that public schools have. And we've seen, not just in Milwaukee and in Cleveland and DC, that vouchers don't make a difference, but in Louisiana, where they began giving vouchers last year, hundreds of thousands of kids were eligible to get them, and only about 8,000 or 9,000 applied for them. But the schools that offered the vouchers, or that accepted the vouchers, many of them were rural church schools that had no curriculum and no certified teachers. So it's hard for me to understand why this is supposed to make education better if you're sending kids to schools with uncertified teachers and no curriculum.
Okay, let's talk just a little bit more about tenure. You have some strong feelings about tenure. In Waiting for Superman, they state 1 out of every 57 physician loses his or her license to practice medicine. 1 out of every 97 lawyers loses their license to practice law. In major cities, many major cities, only 1 out of 1,000 teachers is fired for performance-related issues, and they say the reason why that is because of tenures. They go on to state further, which you refute, that the criticism that they have is that our public schools, tenure has evolved from that original understanding of providing due process to more of a university style of tenure model for life. Doesn't the criticism that the main function of teacher tenure is to help bad teachers keep their jobs at least have a little validity?
No, I actually think that the problem we have with teachers is not getting rid of them, but holding on to them. First of all, if we have too many bad teachers, as I said, that we have an administrator problem. Secondly, about 40% of people who enter teaching will leave teaching within 5 years.
Yeah.
So we're wasting a lot of money training people, helping people become teachers, and then they find they can't handle the work, that they're not getting any support, they have poor leadership, whatever the reason, 40% are gone. So we have a very serious retention problem, and instead of focusing on how do we fire bad teachers, we should be focused on how do we raise our standards to bring in the people who want to make a career of teaching and who have the preparation to be good at it, and then when they enter teaching, give them the support and the mentoring to be good teachers. And then have salary commensurate with the profession. I mean, it's unbelievable. There are states in this country where you can work 15 years and not make $40,000 a year. And there are teachers in some states that are eligible for food stamps. This is nutty. So I think that the problem, if we're going to have a profession, is not to have a guillotine over the heads of people who've won tenure, but to change the profession to focus on raising quality at the outset, not relying on Teach for America, which is just a stepping stone operation, and instead building a profession which has the respect of the public.
Let me go just a little bit further. Let me just push this a bit there. For example, in Los Angeles, there was a report in 2003. A union representative said, if I'm representing them, it's impossible to get them out. It's impossible, unless they committed a lewd act. One union representative said, I've gone in and defended teachers who shouldn't even be pumping gas. This is from the union people. People are asking, and a valid question, do teachers' unions act in the best interest of children? Is that what they do? Or are they just set up to protect the teachers and without thought of what is happening to the kids?
Well, it's hard to answer a blanket question like that, first of all, because I don't know the facts of what the union cases were, or whether what was said was true. And I would say that was 2003, this is 2015. Unions are now so much on the defensive, and who would have believed that the state of Michigan, where teacher unionism was so strong, is now a right-to-work state. Indiana is now a right-to-work state. Tennessee is a right-to-work state. So unions are very much in retreat, and I think the percentage of American workers that are unionized is somewhere around 11% now, maybe 11.3, and most of those are public sector workers, and they're under assault. I mean, you would think that the unions had bankrupted our economy in 2008. I think it was the banks. But, my own view is that people should have, if you want to call it that, a speedy due process. I don't think that it should be something that's dragged out over years. And for instance, in New York City, there was a lot of publicity to the rubber room. Mm-hmm. And so this was created by Joel Klein. And the way to resolve issues was to have a hearing. But it was up to the administration to provide the hearing. And the administration could keep people there for years without a hearing. And if people thought they were innocent, why should they accept being fired without a hearing? Yeah. But that was up to the administration, and it somehow became a union problem. And I think that unions exist in part first of all, they exist to make sure the teachers have a voice at the table. So when the governor says we're going to cut the budget by $1 billion, there has to be somebody representing teachers saying, don't do it, look what's going to happen. There has to be some, teachers have to have a place at the table. But I think that unions have to recognize that if they're bad teachers, they have to do as they do under peer assistance and review. The unions are fully supportive of peer assistance and review. They're fully involved in the process, and they recognize that if somebody is not a good teacher and they're tenured, they have to go.
Okay, we're starting to run out of time, but I want to get to this question and help me out here, because I've been running around saying we need to find common ground. And you asked me before we came out here whether or not I thought we were going to find common ground tonight, and I said no. But where can compromises be made by you or by all of us in order to move the debate away from some of the vitriol that characterizes a lot of the arguments today? How do we move forward collaboratively in the best interest? I talked about this when we were downstairs. I know some of the people who are supporting and funding reform efforts. Some of them are alumni of Lehigh. A couple of them I've known for several years, and they're friends of mine. And I know them. They aren't doing it for monetary gain. They're not doing it for political reasons. They see a bureaucracy in the public schools that often thwarts meaningful change. They are putting their money and their time into these efforts because they want to help kids, in particular kids in urban settings where we've seen millions of dollars expended with no real lasting results in a lot of cases. They want to see if something else might work where other things have failed. Have you got a little bit of an olive branch to extend?
Well, I think it's, first of all, and this is the speech I started to write, and then I decided instead I'd debate myself. You have to begin by agreeing on facts. And so if I could sit down with any number of reformers and say, can we agree that it's most important to raise standards for teachers, they'd probably say, but, you know, Teacher America has to be included. And I'd say, no, I don't think so. So that would be hard to find common ground unless we talked about having a stable teaching profession, not one where there's constant churn of young people who provide low-wage workers. It would be hard to find common ground around charters unless reformers agreed that charters should serve the needs of society in providing for the kids with greatest needs, not the kids in poor communities that are the highest performing. That's different. I think that there's a mythology about the public schools that consist of smears, and I think that has to stop. I mean, the public schools have been subject now to at least a 10-year campaign, if not longer, of failing, declining. I mean, I could document this again and again, and it's just not true. The biggest problems are where there's the highest poverty. So I would love to be able to have a summit with some of the leading reformers and say, could we agree that the biggest problem in our schools is that so many kids come with way behind and need extra help and extra resources. And I'll just give you an example of where the reform theory falls apart. I happened to reread the other day an article that was in the New Yorker last spring about Newark, where Mark Zuckerberg put up $100 million. And Newark is directly under the control of Governor Chris Christie. And Mayor Cory Booker, now Senator Booker, but Mayor Cory Booker and Governor Christie brought Mark Zuckerberg to Newark, and they said, put $100 million here. We will turn Newark within 5 years into a model urban school system. Well, don't you know the $100 million has been eaten up by reform consultants? Newark is not a model school system. Cory Booker said in the article that was published last May, I think it was, give it 2 or 3 more years. I don't think it's going to be a model school system in 2 or 3 more years. There are protests in the streets even now, and they just elected a mayor opposed to what Chris Christie wants, and it's a very volatile situation. But with all of the political stars aligned and with all of that extra money, they still have these deep, deep problems. Because, why? Because, first of all, there's no democracy. People have been disempowered. They're hostile towards the people leading the school system. They have no voice. The school superintendent won't even attend school board meetings. They had everything there. If reform works, it could have worked there. They got a new teacher's contract. They got merit pay, et cetera, et cetera. We have to address the root causes. So if I could find some reformers who would agree with me that the root causes of low school performance are poverty and segregation, then we might begin to work on a positive program to turn this around. And that if you're talking about tenure, for example, I would say to you that the highest performing districts in this country have teachers who are tenured. So how can this be a cause of low performance? In New York, where I live, Scarsdale is probably the highest performing district. Almost all the teachers are tenured, and they fight to get in. Why? Because all the kids are rich and easy to teach. and you know, they have a lot of money to teach the kids with. But it's a high-performing district. The same would be true, I'm sure, in the state of Pennsylvania, that the highest performing districts have tenured teachers. Tenure is not the independent variable here. But anyway, where can we find common ground? Let me think a while. It would have to be on the idea that charters serve the neediest. And also they should give up this idea that Reed Hastings, the owner of Netflix, expressed that he wants 90% of all schools in America to be charter schools. That's a kind of, I seek to conquer and destroy you, not a collaborative attitude. And I remember many years ago when I was on the other side, and I went to see a very wealthy banker who is supporting the Manhattan Institute, a conservative institute, and I was all hot for choice and charters and wherever this would go, and he said, look, the United States is always going to have 80% of its kids in public schools. And I think now, back to that conversation, that's a reasonable ground to begin. If we're always going to have at least 80% of our kids in public schools, and 10% in religious schools, and religious and independent schools, and 10% in charter schools, then we can begin to have a conversation and find common ground. But so many in the charter sector say, we're better than you, and we're going to drive you into the sea. And it's like Teach for America saying, not only are our young people smarter than you, there are better teachers than experienced veteran teachers who've had all the teacher training in the world. That's ridiculous. And so if the reformers, so-called reformers, would give up their triumphalist winner-take-all attitude, which is not grounded in evidence, then there would be common ground. But they have to give that up.
I'm afraid that's all the time we have tonight, although I could do this all night with a bottle of wine and just sit and talk. Thank you for your time, for your insight, and your work for children. Everybody, Diane Ravitch.